Information about the Shaws here. His name was Seth Lewis Shaw, and his wife was Isabella. And Seth was born in 1818, and Isabella in 1825 in Ireland. Seth was born in Vermont, and he learned cabinetry, and then he loved art, and so he became an artist, and then a photographer. He learned photography, which was really early because it was before 1850. He met Isabella in Tennessee, and they came to California by wagon train across the plains in the early 1850s. And then he came for the gold rush like most of the people that came in early. He mined unsuccessfully, and then he ran a successful photography studio in San Francisco until he came up north. His brother Stephen convinced him to come up here to try farming, and he was probably an interesting guy because he was an artist and a photographer, and then a farmer. He had a lot of different interests. So he came up in 1852. He was one of the first 12 guys in here that year, and he owned about half the town. The other half of town, his brother Stephen owned this half. There wasn't a town, of course. He only had one house, but it was his. So he started building the Shaw House in 1854, which is amazing because there was nobody here except natives. And then all of a sudden they're building a house. So where do you get lumber? Where do you get doorknobs? Where do you get windows? It amazes me that happened that early. So he started that in 1854, and they finished it in 1866. And just for an interesting side note, the style of that house is Carpenter Gothic, so it seems appropriate for today. And it's on Main Street, just out of the business district on the left. So he was Justice of the Peace here. He was the first postmaster, became county coroner and census enumerator. And one of the people buried here in the mausoleum with him is a woman named Biddy Brainerd, and she was a Native American who was indentured to the Shaw family. Her parents were killed in one of the massacres, and so she became indentured at the age of 6 to the Shaw family, and worked with them until she was 18, then got married, and after she died, she was buried here with. She ended up marrying, having 4 kids, died early, and was buried with the Shaw family that she worked with as a young girl. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And if you have any corrections, that's okay too. Because we're going to go next. Okay, yeah.
How did they get over here? Were there ferries or anything operating at the time?
Across the river?
Yeah.
Probably, I think they borrowed a native dugout canoe. So I don't know how borrowed it was, or
but to bring supplies over and everything.
Early on, probably just by canoe, or
Wow.
maybe they had barges.
Sorry, the story. It was also popular to take the wheels off of your wagon for the wagon train, please.
And float them, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, they made sort of a barge out of them.
Is that Shaw House a bed and breakfast now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And in the summertime, they could bring things in because the eel gets low enough that there
Right.
would be fords.
Right.
But in the wintertime, they were probably pretty cut off here.
Yeah.
For some reason. So he came to the U.S. in 1841 to Pennsylvania, where he worked in the coal mines. If you're Welsh, I guess you know how to work in the coal mines. So that was his first job. And then he moved to Galena, Illinois in 1843. And Galena was where Ulysses Grant grew up. He knew the Grant family when he was in Illinois. He was a butcher there. And then the gold rush came, and he crossed the plains in 1850. He he bought a team of oxen and came across the plains. 6 months it took him to get to California. And when he got to the gold fields, his shoes were worn out. He had his feet wrapped in rags. He was half starved. He'd been on half rations for the last month. And his clothes had almost no clothes because he used them all up. So he went to work. Let's see, what was the town? Nevada City is where he worked gold mines. And he sent back the next year for his wife, Grace. He'd married Grace in Illinois, and their baby. Their baby was just 2 years old. And so he told her that it was too tough to come across country, so he suggested she go across Panama. So she traveled 1,600 miles to get to New York City by boat and by stagecoach and by train. Gets to New York City, rests one day, gets on a steamship for Panama, travels, it was 9 days to get to Panama. And then when she gets to Panama, she's got to hire a team of natives to pull her open dugout canoe up the Chagres River. And that took 7 or 8 days. The baby got sick because it was open canoe, no shelter from the weather. Baby got a fever. She was dipping the baby in the river to cool it off, to lower the fever. She gets up to the end of the river and hires muleteers to take her the rest of the way over to the Pacific coast. The baby travels in a burlap sack slung over one of the natives' shoulders. She gets to the coast, no baby. And 2 hours later, the native guy shows up. He stopped to let the baby sleep. And she was all panicky, but then she's got the baby again. Gets on a 13-day boat trip to San Francisco. She's sick the whole time. Baby's having a great time because everybody's spoiling the baby, and the baby wasn't getting seasick. Gets to San Francisco, has to get on a riverboat up to Sacramento, and then another stagecoach to Nevada City. And she gets off the stage and she hugs her husband. She says, "I don't ever want to hear about your busted up shoes again." So they came to Ferndale eventually, and he bought out Stephen Shaw's share of town, which is this side of town. And they started, he had a small dairy, and then they started the Francis Land and Water Company. My glasses are getting fogged up for some reason. Gieselman. And I don't know if he would have been buried in the pauper's grave or his stone has just, maybe it never existed. A lot of the early burials, they put wooden markers, and then over time they disintegrated. And we have records that he's buried there in that open spot, but we're not exactly sure where. John Gieselman came from France, and he moved to New Orleans. He's one of the veterans, but he was a veteran of the Confederate Army. He moved to New Orleans, joined the Confederate Army, fought for the South. He was a citizen of Missouri, and then he made his way to Ferndale. He and his wife Martha came to Ferndale, and he was a boot and shoemaker and had a store right next to the fire department, or the fire hall in Ferndale. He was known as a crazy Frenchman. And he had a horse named Reno, and he rode his horse every day down to Salt River, where him and his horse would take to swim. And that was his constant routine. And he also rode Reno to Eureka and back in a single day, which several times, I guess, which was quite a feat back then because there was creeks to cross and all kinds of stuff. So he rode in the parades in his Confederate uniform, which maybe didn't make him totally popular. And he also always made an appearance for Bastille Day. So he'd get all dressed up and come up to Main Street for Bastille Day. His horse Reno would go in the house with him and have supper. And Reno liked both meat and sugar, and he took a little sip of whiskey too, besides, I guess. His wife died of pneumonia in 1895, and then Reno got sick and had to be put down. And he had a friend that took care of him for a year, but he just got tired of living. And so he shot himself in the heart and then in the head, and he's buried here next to Martha. So they're both buried in that plot. Family here in Ferndale, and they still are very prominent. I think they still own about 50,000 acres here in Humboldt County. So his story is, he was born in Maine, and we'll come to it. Okay. Born in Maine, and he had limited education, mostly in district schools, and he worked in New England as a teamster, driving horses, and a shopkeeper, and then he was a part owner of a sawmill. So he'd had some business experience, and he kind of pursued business rather than just random gold feverish stuff. So he heard about the gold rush, and he came to California around the Horn. Bought a herd of cattle down in the Central Valley and drove them overland to Humboldt County, which must have been just a tremendous feat. Arrived here in 1852 and put his cattle up on Bear River Ridge, which is just south of here. And then in 1853, he went back to the valley, got another herd of cattle, and brought them up to Eureka. And he ended up opening a meat market and did that for a number of years. And then he started investing in land, and he got up to 50,000 acres, 4,000 cattle, and 13,000 sheep. And he was really involved in the dairy industry, which is noteworthy to me because I was a dairyman my whole career. And what he would do, he would bring in people from first Switzerland and Denmark, and then Portugal, and then Italy to work his dairies. He would divide them up into like 100 cow dairies. And so these people would come in, they would work for him for a few years, then he would rent them the land to run their own operation, and then pretty soon they would move on and rent their own farms and then buy them. So he brought in a whole wave of different ethnic groups, and kind of led to the success of the valley, because we really built our prosperity here on dairy products and butter. Cemetery found these plots here that weren't full yet, bought them, and then he had to come up with an idea for the tombstone. So kind of unique. And if you want to see the recipe for the carrot cake cupcakes, it's behind that one of his wives. He put her carrot cake recipe on there. And he has one more addition, and he's going to put on the back of his, the carrot cake is to die for. Well, thank you folks for coming.